Hi, folks, and welcome to another episode of Israel Explained. Today, I'd like to talk about Blinken's visit to Israel, which may turn out to be a turning point in American policy towards the war, and therefore also a turning point in Israeli policy towards the war, depending on how it reacts to this. There are two new elements, and I'll try to put them into perspective in this video. One new element is an American investment in the return of Gazan refugees from the south to their homes in the north. And another new element is the introduction of the prospect of Saudi normalization yet again. Yeah, that old chestnut is back on the table. So let's talk about where that fits into things. So Blinken showed up um, asking for a lowering of flames on both fronts, both Hezbollah and Hamas. Let's talk a little bit about Lebanon because that's not what we're going to focus on today. There, the United States seems ready to punt, hoping that Israel will lower the flames and that Hezbollah will stop firing when Israel stops the operation in Gaza, or at least reaches a certain low level of the operation in Gaza. The US is hoping to have some sort of diplomatic process there, which I doubt they believe in much. Basically, to put a band-aid on it throughout this election year. That's what they're doing, and I think we're going to talk about that more in future videos. In Gaza, things are a little bit more complicated. Some people thought that because Israel had started its move to the lower intensity element of the conflict, um, there would be more agreement on this. But it looks like the US wants to make sure that Israel follows through on this on all fronts. This also seems to hint that the United States doesn't want to see Israel go into Rafah because that would be an escalation. And the last thing the US wants right now is um, an escalation. But the most important demand that the US is introducing to this right now is, as I said, the return of Palestinian refugees from the north to their homes. And we also saw this element come through, and this underscores the seriousness of it from the American perspective in some other things that they said. As always, Blinken said that Israel needs to kill less Palestinians in this operation, which is certainly something that most of us are thinking. Uh, but he also this time added the importance of sparing Palestinian infrastructure, something that he hadn't done in the past and possibly is regretting considering that most buildings in Gaza have been hit in this operation. The UN has appointed a delegation to try to facilitate the return of citizens to their homes in the north. And perhaps the main achievement that Blinken had in this visit was that he got Netanyahu to agree to cooperate with it. Blinken said of new Gaza humanitarian UN coordinator, Sigrid Kaag, quote, she has America's full support. She must have Israel's full support as well. I don't know if she has Israel's full support, but Netanyahu is going to allow her to do her job. And I'm sure he will face some criticism on that from his coalition, but he has done so. However, the Israeli government's position, and I believe it's a wise one, is that it's not going to allow the Palestinian refugees to return to their home until the hostages are released. This is a pretty good use of a important amount of leverage that Israel has, and I think that doing so makes another hostage deal more likely rather than less likely. It gives Israel a little bit more of an edge in negotiations. Blinken also demanded more humanitarian aid come into Israel, into Gaza. He mentioned Karen Shalom being opened. He wants to see more aid come in through the UN. Of course, Israel is very hesitant to strengthen the UN. The Netanyahu government hopes, and this again is something I think is a good initiative, to try to get the UN to have as little influence in the newly rebuilt Gaza as possible. Unfortunately, it's undercutting that by not offering any alternatives to the UN, making it inevitable that people will turn back to them. Blinken also asked for and received guarantees that Israel is not going to encourage the immigration of people from Gaza. There have been op-eds and statements by various Israeli politicians saying that that should be a goal of policy. And Netanyahu has said that will not be a goal of Israeli policy. That certainly would damage Israel greatly diplomatically. Other demands that Blinken made involved preventing settler terrorism, which he says undermines the prospects for a two-state solution, preventing home demolitions of terrorists in the West Bank, something that Israel has done in the past, which doesn't necessarily have very good deterrent effects, according to some Israeli studies. And he demanded that tax money that belongs to the UN be released to the UN, something the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, has posed and may be difficult to do as long as he is in his job. Now, all of these smaller steps are things that Netanyahu may agree to, but the reason that they're being raised is because they will set the stage or make it easier to reach a two-state solution. And Blinken said clearly that without a two-state solution on the horizon, this conflict cannot be resolved. The next steps can't be reached. Netanyahu says that that is a security impossibility, but the real biggest problem from his perspective, as we know, is mostly political. After all, what Biden and Blinken are asking for isn't much. They're not asking for an immediate Palestinian state. They're asking for Israel to say that this is a process at the end of which there may be a Palestinian state, something that Israel has done in the past in Oslo, and that Netanyahu has acknowledged in the Bar Ilan speech. But because of the current government, is a political impossibility. But this time, rather than just make demands on Israel, Blinken has come with a carrot. And that carrot, of course, is Saudi normalization. And Saudi normalization is a major incentive for two reasons. One, it's good for Israel. It allows Israel to build a coalition with the anti-Iranian states in a more open way that guarantees, or I shouldn't say guarantees, that if properly implemented, could bolster its security significantly. Second, it's something that Netanyahu needs. Netanyahu's popularity is incredibly low. In all the polls, he's getting about half as many mandates as his rival Benny Gantz, and the war is not going completely according to plan. Wouldn't call it a failure or anything, but there is a sense that the war is turning into a quagmire. It's quagmire-esque at this point, I would say, showing signs of quagmirization. If Netanyahu can get a major diplomatic achievement like this, he can rebuild his vaunted reputation as the great diplomatic master and say, sure, I screwed up on October 7th, but could Gantz ever pull off anything like this, etc., etc. So it's a real carrot on the strategic level and on the political level. Blinken noted, quote, this only comes from a regional approach that includes a pathway to a Palestinian state. There's a second carrot as well. This isn't new, but Blinken showed a real commitment to it on this trip. He met with hostage families with foreign passports and sounded optimistic about a deal. The subtext for Blinken's involvement in this and the increased involvement of the Biden administration on this issue is that they are willing to put their full weight, the full weight of the presidency, behind another hostage deal. If that hostage deal comes with the kind of diplomatic um, commitment to a two-state solution, the kind of diplomatic gains that Blinken and Biden want. It's important to remember that the last hostage deal came to fruition when Biden put his foot firmly down in favor of it. That was the final thing that solidified the deal. The US has the ability not necessarily to guarantee that it works, but to make it more likely. They're putting the full weight of the presidency behind it. So, what they're offering Israel is um, normalization with Saudi Arabia, hostage deal. Those are two big wins for Netanyahu on a personal and political level, and not just on a strategic level that could help make up for the problems on the operational level. Of course, ending the conflict now would also be a defeat for Israel because Hamas is still in power. So we're going to see how Israel handles this new dilemma that the United States has handed to it, where you can get some of these strategic achievements and not others. And then will Israel try to go after those achievements, or will it try to go after the military achievements that have so far eluded it? And that's something that we're going to be following here very closely. And we have, as usual, some great questions from you. So, Harry Newhoff asks, the IDF must take over Rafah. You spoke about this previously. When and how will they take over Rafah? Well, as I think arose from this video, the possibility of Israel taking over Rafah seems to be becoming more remote rather than more likely. The reason for that is the U.S. doesn't want Israel to escalate, but just as importantly, maybe even more importantly, is that Egypt doesn't want Israel to escalate. Israel is constantly in talks with Egypt over Rafah. I've been incredibly impressed by the fact that those talks have not leaked. The Egyptians don't leak this sort of thing much because they don't want people knowing how closely they cooperate with Israel on security, most likely. And in the Israeli case, don't think uh, the Israeli military and the Israeli government want it to be known how many concessions they're making to Egypt and how much they're taking Egyptian policy into account. So I think that those two elements are making it less and less likely that Israel is going to take over Rafah. On a military level, I completely agree with you, Harry. Israel has to take over Rafah. Despite all the limitations I talked about here, and they're very serious ones, I think Israel should risk it all and go in. And then worry later about the fallout. Because otherwise, Hamas will simply not be defeated. And all these diplomatic achievements I talked about with Hamas not defeated, I'm not sure they're going to mean all that much. So you asked when and how. I don't know. The question is if. And I don't think there's much of a window for it because the US is expecting Israel to lower the level of the operation. So I think within the next 2 weeks at the latest, if Israel's going to do it. John Price asks, does a lower phase mean the IDF will basically stop advancing or that they will advance slower with higher casualties? Has the IDF the will to conquer all of the Gaza Strip by the end of the year? So those two questions link up. It's basically the same question. If Israel is not going to go into Rafah, it has no particular reason to go anywhere else. There's really nothing meaningful left once Khan Yunis is taken, aside from Rafah. There are other areas, it's just that they're not that important. And if Rafah hasn't taken, Israel hasn't taken everything anyway. You asked if they'll advance slower and with higher casualties. They are advancing slower right now. Mostly that's because there's nowhere to go that's important. As for higher casualties, I don't think so. The fact that yesterday Israel lost 9 soldiers, tragically, that was a sort of freak accident. I don't think that that's the norm going forward. But yeah, like I said, Israel conquering the entire Gaza Strip, it's not a question of the IDF having the will. The IDF has the will and the ability. It's not a problem. It's a question of diplomatic and political will. That is a different issue. And, like I talked about, Netanyahu has real reasons to worry about doing that, but I still think that it's worth it. Syra asked, final question. Israel killed the top Hezbollah commander, Wissam Tawlin, in a strike in South Lebanon. Will this escalate to a full war? The answer to that is probably no. There are certain red lines that the two sides are currently um, abiding by. And it's very interesting to see. Hezbollah is not shooting rockets at Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem and the major concentrations of civilians in the south. Meanwhile, Israel is not assassinating Hezbollah leaders in Beirut. So both sides know that they have somewhere to escalate to. Israel could also theoretically put boots on the ground in Lebanon. Neither side seems to want that. In fact, most of what Hezbollah seems to be doing right now is showing that they're doing enough as part of the war in Gaza, but they have no interest in a war. There are elements in Israel that do want to escalate to a war. So Israel wants a war more than Lebanon does. And the reason for that is because it's not clear when there's going to be another chance. Hezbollah is getting incredibly strong. There's a threat that Hezbollah will do what Hamas did in the future. But considering the amount of pressure the US and the moderate Arab states are putting on Israel, I don't think that they will escalate. I don't think Netanyahu will go that route. Therefore, my guess is that things will continue to be on a pretty high level until the war in Gaza clearly has gone to a lower level of violence, not just talk, not just removing some troops, but actually a lower level of violence. Then Hezbollah will have an excuse to lower theirs, and I think we'll avoid a war. Obviously, things are unstable, and I could be wrong, but that would definitely be my bet at this point. Okay, so thank you for joining me for another episode of Israel Explained. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Israel Media. Consider listening to my podcast, History of the Land of Israel podcast. I will put the links underneath this video, and I will see you here tomorrow.